All right. So this sermon came from unboxing, no surprise. A lot of things come from there because God moves and he speaks during unboxing in very powerful ways. So this sermon comes from there. Obviously, it's just expanded upon, and it is more defined and refined. So the title of my sermon, as you can see, is Until the Sun Comes Up. Okay? Until the sun comes up. And this is very important because the sun will rise on everybody's life. It's just, are you prepared? Are you prepared to fight for that day? Okay? So the intro, nice and simple, is we are always wrestling. We wrestle with ourselves, we wrestle with others, we wrestle with the enemy, and we wrestle with God. Wrestling is violent. It takes complete focus, it is exhausting, and will drain you of all your energy. And yet wrestling with the Lord is not always a bad thing. Right? Sometimes if you do not wrestle with God and the things of God, you will not be blessed. Because we do not wrestle against doing evil, we wrestle with doing good. We wrestle with accepting who God has said we are. We wrestle with believing in the promises of God. We wrestle with being consistent and steadfast in God. And we wrestle with the effort of wrestling. Right? So many times we give up on wrestling because we get tired. But of course you will. If you've ever wrestled a day in your life, listen, after like 2.5 minutes, you're like, I'm good. I'm exhausted. And yet you have to keep going. Right? You have to keep going, because what I mean by all of this is if God has said you are not alone, you don't wrestle with loneliness, you run to it as your default. Instead, you wrestle with accepting that God has said you are not alone, and you have to keep wrestling with it until it blesses you. You're not wrestling against loneliness, you're wrestling to accept the Word of God. And whenever you stop wrestling before the Word has blessed you, you run back to what you know, which is the loneliness. Right? And that is just an example. For whatever it is in your life, there's probably multiple. There's probably multiple things that you wrestle with accepting, that you wrestle with knowing to be true for yourself. And you have to wrestle with it. You have to wrestle with it until you know that it's true.
That's right. That's right.
Plain and simple. Right? Because if you think you're going to wrestle with the opposite thing, you're always going to lose to that thing. You're not going to tackle something like loneliness and come out on top. You're just not. You can wrestle with accepting what God has said, though. And when you actually prevail against it, you'll know that you're not alone. Right? You will know it. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that example. I still got to go through another verse first. But you'll know it in your body. Right? It will be a truth for you. It will be the truth for you. Right? Because we wrestle with accepting the truth and we run to the lie. Right? That's realistically what we do. We'll run to something like doubt. We'll run to something like fear. We'll run to the norm that we know when we get tired of fighting to believe the thing he has said.
Yes.
So Isaiah chapter 59, verse 7, it reads, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity, wasting, and destruction are in their paths. Right? This verse is still true for us today, not because we are evil, but because we still love the dark. We still prefer evil to good, not because it is better for us, not because it is more enjoyable for us, but because it is easier. Right? It's easier to get upset and stay upset
That's right.
than to choose not to be upset anymore. Right? It's easier to get offended and not forgive
That's right.
than it is to forgive. Right? It's easier to accept the negative things than it is to accept the positive things.
That's right.
It's easier for you to question God where this, that, and the other is in your life than it is for you to trust and believe that it's there. Right? So what is the thing that you're actually wrestling with? Is it the negative? No. Right? Because you willfully and easily give yourself into it.
That's right.
Right? But we are reluctant to fight with and wrestle with what God has said until we prevail and it becomes the truth in our life.
Thank you, Lord.
Right? It's easier to run to evil than it is to wrestle with what's right.
Thank you, Jesus.
And what's right is what God says.
That's right.
That's what's right. What's right is what God has said over you. What's right is what God has promised you. That's what's right. But of course, the evil is the easier thing. Why? Because you don't have to change. You don't have to do anything to change. You feel some type of way, you can just keep feeling that way. You're upset by something, you can stay upset. You want to be a jerk about something, you can be a jerk. You don't have to make yourself better. But when you wrestle with the right thing, you force yourself to be better. Right? You're forcing yourself to accept what God has said. You're forcing yourself to believe what God has said. You're forcing yourself to trust what God has said instead of surrendering yourself over to the default, which is the dark. Right? That's the default. That's the default for all of us. I know it is because we slip into it so easily. We slip into it sometimes eagerly. Right? You get upset. You want to stay upset and you want to justify how you're upset. And everybody's got to hear that you're upset and everybody's got to see that you're upset. And it's like, how about you stop being upset or you just let it go, but you don't want to wrestle with that. You don't want to put in the effort to do that. Right? That's accepting the evil instead of running to what's right. Right? It's easier to accept loneliness. Right? It's easier to accept fear. It's easier to accept doubt. It's easier to accept misery. It's easier to accept stubbornness. It's easier to accept pride, envy, personal excuses, the promise will never happen, the lack of self-worth, the self-degradation, the evil than it is for any of us to wrestle with the good until it is made true in our bodies.
Amen. Thank you, Lord.
Because there comes a point where you wrestle with the things of God until you prevail, and it's the truth. No matter what happens, that's the new truth in your life. Doesn't matter who says whatever, doesn't matter what happens, that is the truth. But you have to wrestle with it, you have to fight with it until it's true. If you don't, it will never be. If you don't, and if you don't continuously, you'll be in a cycle of just wrestling and wrestling and wrestling and wrestling. That doesn't mean you'll never be upset, but you bounce back.
Yes.
Doesn't mean you'll never have an attitude, but you bounce back. Right? All of this is about the speed in which you do it, about how hard it is to get you to that point where you are upset, to get you to that point where you're frustrated, to get you to that point where you're disappointed, to get you to that point where you're miserable. How long does it take you? And how willing are you to go into it? Right? It's easier to eat another donut, another piece of cake, watch another episode, and relax for another hour than it is to wrestle with yourself to get up and exercise. Right? We've all been there. Right? What do you fight? You're not fighting to watch another episode. You're not like, oh man, ooh, that was a hard decision for me to make. You're not You're not fighting to get another snack, to get another dessert. That's the easy, right? That's the enjoyable. That's the ooh, well, I'm a little peckish. Why not? Right? The wrestling is the uh, let me go change my clothes and put my shoes on. Depending on where you live or what you have around you or what you do for exercise, let me get in my car or drive to the gym or go outside, go for a run, whatever. That's what you're wrestling with. But that's where you can prevail. And that's where you need to prevail. Right? Not with the extra dessert, not with the extra cake. But you need to wrestle with the good thing and prevail against the good thing. Right? But we still run to evil. And that's Ra. R-A-H. It's really R-A space apostrophe. But it means bad, disagreeable, unpleasant, unhappiness, misery, unkind, bad of value, distress, injury, and wrong. Right? And how many of you have chosen to be unpleasant because of a comment? An attitude, a response, a situation, or whatever else, instead of wrestling not to be unpleasant, despite what someone may have said or what the situation is. I know it's everybody. You don't have to answer at once. I know it's everyone. Right? You've chosen just to be a jerk. Let's be honest. You could have not. You know you could have not. But that's what you chose. Instead of wrestling with, let me let it go. It doesn't matter. It's not important. It's not a big deal. Let me move on. Right? But how many of you have chosen to be unhappy or in misery instead of wrestling with trusting in the promises and words of God? Right? How many of you sat and you sulked? I know I have. I know you have too. You just sit and you sulking. And it's a waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of joy. It's a waste of everything. All right? How many of you have chosen to stay in injury instead of wrestling with healing? All right? All of us have. Not because we prefer it or it's better for us, because we'll be the first person to tell you it's wrong, and yet still stay in the evil because it's easier. And we don't want to wrestle with God anymore. All right? We don't want to wrestle with Him to see the things He has said as being the truth in us. You wrestle until the sun comes up. Right? You don't get to choose. Well, I've been wrestling with this thing for a week. I should be over it. That's not your choice. I've been wrestling with this thing for a month. I should be over it. It's not your choice. And more realistically is, have you actually been wrestling with it? Or have you only kind of, sort of? Because unless you're wrestling with it daily, if you're only wrestling with it twice a week, you're not doing a very good job. Because every day in between, you're starting over. You're not starting from where you left off, you're starting over. There are things we have to wrestle with daily for our good. There are things we have to wrestle with consistently for our good. Right? Because the enemy's never going to shut up. He's never going to stop talking in your life. Your flesh is never going to stop talking in your life. It's never going to be quiet. So what do? You wrestle until the point where you're tired, and then it's like, okay, well, I'll give in to it. I'll give in to him, or do you keep going? Right? Do you keep fighting? If you want a breakthrough, you better fight for it. If you want deliverance, you better wrestle for it. If you want freedom, you better fight for it. Listen, this is not a peaceful and a passive walk. This isn't a peaceful and a passive lifestyle. Right? My mother just said we were made to be carriers of fire. What part of fire is peaceful? I'm sorry, but have you ever held it and been like, yeah, this is comfortable? Right? You have to fight. Right? You have to fight. Because if you don't, all that's left ahead of us is wasting and destruction. Right? And you know that's true in your own life because you've not fought for something one day, and that one day has turned into a week. That week has turned into a month. All because of one time, one moment where you could have fought, where you could have overcome, where you could have won, and you chose not to. We have to fight. We have to wrestle. Right? We have to wrestle. Because otherwise, we're just wasting. Otherwise, we're just being destroyed. And you can tell if you're wasting and being destroyed if you've been more irritable. If you've been more irritable lately, it's because you've stopped wrestling. If you've been more stubborn, it's because you've stopped wrestling. If you've been more upset, angry, hurt, fearful, miserable, found yourself in a hole, a place, a position spiritually where you say, oh God, you got to do something, but your attitude is funky and your actions lazy, it's because you have stopped wrestling. But until that sun comes up, you can't stop wrestling with the goodness of God. It doesn't matter how long it takes. You either want it or you don't. You either want the breakthrough or you don't. You either want the fire or you don't. You either want the change or you don't. There are things you just need to fight with. You just need to contend with. You just need to wrestle with. Listen, no one likes dieting. Crazy people are in love with working out. No one loves these things. You wrestle with them consistently and constantly. You wrestle with eating the good thing because sometimes you want the bad. You wrestle with getting up to work out because sometimes you want another hour of sleep. But do you want it? Right? Do you want it? So we're going to the main story, and you should know what it is. It's Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. Because let's say everything you need to know, you could find in Genesis. You just have to actually read. All right, so verse 22 through 31, Genesis 32. And he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of the joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? He said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked, saying, tell me your name, I pray. And he said, why is it that you ask about my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Penuel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Right? Wrestled here is abak, to wrestle, grapple, get dusty. Why? Because you're going to get dirty. This ain't a clean fight. You're going to get dusty. Right? He struggled with, which is Sarah, S-A-R-A. Just take away the H. Contend, have power, contend with, persist, exert oneself, persevere. Right? This wrestling is actual physical wrestling because it's going to take effort from you. It's going to take effort from you like you haven't exerted before. It's going to take spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical effort that you have to be willing to give at all times. This isn't light and easy work. It's never been meant to be. We're wrestling with powers that we don't understand, with powers we can't contend with. But what we can do is persist. That's what we can do. Because when we wrestle with God for the things of God, we cannot lose. We can only give up. When you wrestle with what God has promised you, when you wrestle with what God has spoken over you, you can't lose that fight. But you can choose to walk away from it. You can choose to stop believing in it. Right? You can choose to give up on it. You can choose to think it's passed you by. You can choose to think you've missed the opportunity. You can choose to believe the promises are scattered and gone. You can choose to believe you're never going to change. You can choose to give up and walk away. But when you wrestle with it, you can't lose. Oh, it'll happen. But it needs to be wrestled with. It needs to be fought with. It needs to be fought with until it is engraved in you. Right? This blessing, Jacob was, no, not letting you go. Dislocated his hip, still wrestling. Why? Because he did not want to let it go. He refused to let it go. There are things that God has promised you, that he has promised me, that you cannot let go. That's how you'll receive them. No amount of prayer is going to do it. No amount of worship is going to do it. No amount of words are going to do it. No amount of confirmation is going to do it. Only you wrestling with him until he implants that thing in you is going to do it. But are you willing to wrestle? Are you willing to wrestle after you've even gotten hurt? You willing to keep going? I've never wrestled with a dislocated hip, but I imagine it's extremely uncomfortable. And it doesn't matter if he got blessed after. It doesn't matter if he got healed from it after. That during, whoo, I can't even imagine. I've broken my thumb. I've dislocated a toe. I wouldn't want to wrestle with those things. I can't even imagine a hip. But do you want it? How much are you willing to fight for it? Right? Because he didn't give anything up for it. He just wouldn't give up for it. Right? And that needs to be our attitude. There are things that God wants to give that you better fight for. You better wrestle with. Because who knows what Jacob's story would have been if he let him go? Who knows what Jacob's story would have been if he said, I gotta go. And he said, okay. Who knows what his story would have been after he dislocated his hip? He said, you hurt me. I'm not doing this anymore. Who knows what his story would have been when he said, I'm exhausted, so I'm done. Listen, you know who you're wrestling. But are you willing to keep wrestling? Are you willing to keep fighting? right? That is the ultimate question. And you're the only one who can answer it because you're the only one who can accomplish it. I can't wrestle for you, and I wouldn't if I could. I can't fight for you, and I wouldn't if I could. Why? Because my fight's enough. My fight is more than enough for me. Your fight is more than enough for you. I ain't taking on someone else's. You have to do it. I could be in your corner. I could be, hey, drop down, grab the single leg. But that's all I can do. That's all I can do. You have to be the one who's actually there. But Jacob wouldn't give up. Right? He couldn't give up because he had determined in himself that this is the day that I change. This is the day I am blessed. So he hung on to the Lord. He hung on to the Lord until daybreak because he wasn't going to stop before he was blessed. There is a time where the sun will rise in your life. There is a time where the day will break. But are you still holding on when that day comes? Everybody wants it, but are you willing to fight for it? Right? So many times we stop before our blessing. So many times we stop before our promise fulfillment because right before any of the breakthroughs, any of the promises come to pass, you are going to be at your most exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. At the end of the fight, you're more tired than you've ever been. How many times have you been exhausted and you've just called it quits? How many times has something God has called you to do, something God has asked you to do, something God has put in your spirit to do, exhausted you to the point where you give up before the time? You're going to be exhausted. No one's more tired going into a fight than coming out of one. It's the same thing. Right? Don't expect that he's just going to be slamming Gatorades in your face so that you can keep getting re-energized. No, there are things that are going to exhaust you. And this is something that's going to exhaust you. But if you can just hang on, if you can just keep wrestling with God for what he has already made to be yours, if you can just hold on till the sun comes up, God will change your name in all of who you were into all of who he has called you to be. But you have to wrestle. You have to fight. Yes, it's going to be long. Yes, it's going to be grueling. Yes, it's going to be painful because if it wasn't, you wouldn't care about it. I don't care what it is. If it didn't take effort from you, you would not care. If he just dropped healing on you, you wouldn't care about being healed. If he just dropped deliverance on you, you wouldn't care about being delivered. If he just dropped promises and blessing and favor and this, that, and the other on you, you would not care about it. You'd be like, oh, that's cool. And then a week later, it'd be the norm for you. Right? You take it for granted. Whether that's promise fulfillment or healing, regardless of your exhaustion, regardless of what you think you deserve, regardless of what you think you have earned, regardless of what he has promised to give you, there are still things you need to wrestle him for. That's never going to change. There are promises waiting on us. There are things you have to wait for, but there are things that I know are waiting on you. There are breakthroughs I know that are waiting on you. There are talents that are waiting on you. There are gifts that are waiting on you. There are opportunities that are waiting on you because you're not fighting for them. You're not wrestling for them. because you've been hurt, because you're tired. But get over it. I'm sorry. You just got to get over it. Right? You've been hurt, and God has promised to heal you. That's good for you. But you don't get it for free. You don't get it without pain. You don't get it without a fight. Just because you've been hurt doesn't mean he's just going to drop healing in your lap and you don't need to do anything for it. Right? You got to put in the work to change, because even if you got healed, you'd still be the same. Your attitude would still be the same. Still be defensive. Still be pent up. Still refuse to be vulnerable. Still refuse to be open. Still refuse all of these things, because even though you're healed, you're not actually. Because you haven't learned to cope. You haven't learned to deal. You haven't learned to interact. You haven't learned all of these different things. And could God do all of that for you at the same time? Yes, he could. But he's not. Why? Because he's like a parent. He wants you to grow. He wants you to learn. He wants you to overcome. Could he move the mountains and do it all? Yes, he could. Easily. And there are some times and some things in your life that he will, but not everything. Not everything. But do you want it enough to fight for it? Right? Verses 25 and 26, and then dropping down to 28, says, "Now when he said that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, 'Let me go, for the day breaks.' But he said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.'" Verse 28, "And he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed.'" You will get hurt in this fight, and God will hurt you. You're wrestling with God. Don't think you're not going to get hurt. Right? God will hurt you. Your parents will hurt you. Your siblings will hurt you. Your friends will hurt you. Everyone will hurt you at some time or another, but will you fight through the hurt? Will you fight through it? Right? God took Jacob's hip out of its socket, and yet he still fought for his blessing. Right? God has hurt me with the time I have been waiting. Right? And for all the time that I've been waiting, I've been hurt. I've been hurt waiting for what he has promised to give me and bring into my life, but am I willing to keep wrestling with him until the sun comes up in my life? Yes, I am. What other choice does anyone have? What other choice do you have? Listen, you're going to get hurt. Waiting for things is going to hurt. Having to heal from things is going to hurt. And yeah, God's going to be the one to do it. You know why? Because you need to feel it. You need to know it in yourself. You need to remember the time before the promise. Because promise can come and you can forget. Right? Especially the promise that God has made some of you. You'll forget rolling around in the millions. You'll forget driving your car with the massaging front seats. You'll forget. But God needs us to remember. So he's going to imprint it on you. Because the testimony is something that cannot be forgotten. It cannot be wasted. We can't just be people saying, "Oh, you can be like me," driving around Bentleys and Bugattis. Well, how'd you get there? I don't remember. Well, where'd you start? I don't recall. No, you're going to get hurt. It's a wrestling match. You ever seen wrestlers? You ever seen their cauliflower ears? You ever seen MMA? Well, he's beaten up and bloody and stuff. It's going to hurt. You're not even wrestling in a mat. We're wrestling in the dirt. Right? Don't be foolish in believing you won't get hurt in this. Don't be foolish in believing you shouldn't be hurt in this, because there are things he needs to engrave in us. There are things you need to walk around with a limp from to remind yourself of what you went through to get here, to keep you humble. Right? Just as he crossed over Penuel, the sun rose on him and he limped on his hip. That did not change. I'm sure there was no pain. I'm sure God healed it, but the limp remained. Why? Because every time he gets up, he's going to remember. Right? And this is continued on, right? Paul talks about this. Right? The same exact place, too. The thorn in my side. I've asked you to remove, and you said, my grace is sufficient. 3 times. Why? Because, Paul, I need you to remember this. Right? Every time he got up, thorn in his side. Every time Jacob got up, limp in his hip. Because I need you to remember what you fought for. Because when you fight for something, you're not willing to give that thing up. When you've struggled for something, you're not willing to give that thing away. You are not willing to give it away. Even if you can afford something better. All right, this is why my mother had the same car for, was it like 16 years before you gave it to Grandpa? 17 years. Toyota Corolla. She could have gotten a different car. Could have gotten a different car. Could have gotten a better car. My father had to force a new car on her. Why? Because they struggled for that. They fought for it. It wasn't just about getting to A and B. It wasn't just about, well, I like it, I know how it works. It wasn't about that. It was about everything that came before to get to that point. There are things in life that everything that comes before is even more important than that thing. Right? There are things God wants to do that you got to wrestle for, because that wrestling, that time, that experience is going to be more important to you. But are you willing to wrestle for it? All right, there are things you're limping with that will be your blessing, that others will see as a disability, that you know are what blessed you, because they have been engraved in you. All right, your pain will be for your blessing, but you have to fight through that pain. All right, there are testimonies, there are backstories, there are your experiences people will look at, will try and judge you for, and you'll be like, through that, God blessed me. Through that, God formed me. Through that, God shaped me. Through that, God molded me. Through that, God grew me. Through that thing that you see as a disability, that you see as an issue, that you see as, how did you ever make it here? That is what God used to bless me. All right, our focuses always need to shift. Our perspectives always need to change, because the things that hurt, God uses to bless. Yeah, your experience, your backstory, your life story, it sucked. But God let it suck, because he needs it to bless you. And he needs it to bless others. So people will see that limp, but who cares? Who cares if it's for your blessing? Who cares if it's for you? I mean, listen. People could have made fun of Jacob because he's walking on the limp. Do you think he cared? You think when he showed up to his wives and his servants and his sons and all of these people, and they were like, oh my gosh, Jacob, what happened to you? He was like, oh yeah, well, I got injured and stuff. No. I guarantee you he went back praising God. Listen, who cares about the limp? Your concern is about the limp. My concern is that stop calling me Jacob. I'm not Jacob. I'm Israel. If people want to focus on the limp, they want to focus on the Jacob when you've already been made Israel. Who cares?
That part right there.
But do you want to be made Israel? Are you willing to wrestle to prevail against God and man? No one said it's going to be easy. No one said it wouldn't be painful. But are you willing to do it? Are you willing to put in that wrestling? Are you willing to take on that pain? Are you willing to get hurt? Are you willing to walk with that limp? Are you willing to fight all night? Right? You have to wrestle with that healing until it's engraved in you. And though others will see your experience as a limp, you will know it is a blessing. All right, you have to wrestle with that promise. Wrestle with that healing. Wrestle with that new mind. Wrestle with that new spirit. Wrestle with that new attitude. Wrestle with that new view of yourself. You have to wrestle with it until it is a part of you. Until you're not wrestling with it anymore. It is now your daily existence. It's your new normal. But you have to wrestle with it. Right, Matthew chapter 11, verse 12, and from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. There's a reason why Jesus said this, and it's because it's true. Right? The violent take it by force, not the passive. And I know I've used the scripture many times, and I'm going to continue to use it, because you have to be violent in your faith and in your walk. Violence is what led to Jacob becoming Israel, not passivity. Not weeping in tears, not complaining about why haven't you done this or that, not feeling that you are owed the promise, owed the healing, owed the blessing, not feeling that you shouldn't have to fight for it because of what you've been through, but violence. That's what it took. And it has not changed to this day. Violence is what it takes. A violent attitude, a violent demeanor. And I'm not saying, walking around punching people, but a violent commitment. I'm not going to be swayed or dismayed. I'm not going to be dragged off path. I'm not going to be distracted. I'm going to be violent in following this thing out, following this thing through. All right, the violent take it by force. Does that mean that Jacob forced God to bless him? That his persistence and strength allowed him to prevail against God? No. God already promised to bless him. He already promised to make him a nation. But the violence is what moved God to do it. The perseverance is what moved God to do it. The struggle is what moved God to do it. You think he physically prevailed against God? No. With one touch, he dislocated his hip. You're not going to prevail in this like you could prevail in an actual wrestling match. You're going to prevail through the perseverance. You're going to prevail through the struggle. You're going to prevail through the fight. And you're going to prevail through all of the things around it that encompass it that need to be due to prevail. That's how you will. Right? The wrestling is what moved God. The perseverance is what moved God. Right? The though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him. Right? That's Job chapter 13, verse 15. That is what moved God. Even though he dislocated my hip, I'm still going to defend my way. What is his way that he was defending? The promise that was already his. I'm going to defend my own ways before him. Even though he dislocates my hip, I'm still going to trust that out of this, I'm going to be blessed. I don't care if I'm walking with a limp. I don't care if I can't raise my arm above my head. I don't care what is dislocated, what is broken, what is removed, what is cut out. I am going to prevail against this. I am going to defend the word that he has promised me. I am going to keep fighting, even if he's killing me in the fight.
My God. Yes, Lord.
That's how you prevail. Right? You're not going to overpower him. You're not going to outstubborn him like so many of us have tried. You're not going to outweight him. You're not going to outguilt him. Right? You're not going to outmanipulate him. You're not going to outshame him. You're not going to outdeal him. The only way to get what God has promised is through the fight. No deal you can make. No, if you do this, I'll do this. No amount of tears. No amount of time in prayer. No amount of this, that, and the other is going to get you to prevail. The continuous fight until the sun comes up, until the day of the Lord arrives in your life. That is how you prevail. Right? That's what moved God. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him, is what moved God. To prevail against God is to get him to move on your behalf. Right? But he will only move on your behalf when what you are fighting for is his will in your life. And to prevail against him, you have to wrestle. Right? To take the kingdom of heaven, to lay hold on that healing, you need violence. To lay hold on that promise, you need violence. To lay hold on that change, you need violence. To lay hold of that freedom, you need violence. To lay hold of the things of God, you need violence. And you need to keep fighting, even when he kills you. You need to keep wrestling, to accept trust, even when it hurts, and you have nothing left. Because let me tell you, at the end of that, if God didn't bless him, I imagine Jacob would have slept for a day. He would not have walked back. You wrestle for an entire night? No, you sleeping right there. Right? But he was restored when he was blessed. He was restored when he was blessed, and so shall you be. But until that sun comes up, you cannot give up. Until that sun rises, you can't stop wrestling. Until he has blessed you, you can't stop wrestling. Until he has touched you, you can't stop wrestling. Until that promise is manifested, you can't stop wrestling. Until he's healed you, you can't stop wrestling. Until he's delivered you, you can't stop wrestling. Until all of these things that he has promised, that he has spoken, that have been said in his word, you cannot stop wrestling. Because if you think you can do this passively and still receive what God has made for you, specifically for you, you're fooling yourself. You're lying to yourself, thinking it'll just drop out of the air. This is a fight. This is a wrestle. Right? So I wrestle through the wait. I wrestle through the time. I wrestle through the moments. I wrestle through the days. I wrestle through the hours. I'll wrestle through the minutes sometimes. It doesn't get easier. No part of a wrestling match is easier than the next, especially when the person you're wrestling doesn't need a break. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't get exhausted. You do. But listen, go to bed earlier. Go to sleep earlier, because when you wake up, the fight's on again. Listen, make provisions. Go to sleep earlier, because the fight is on as soon as you wake up. Right? The fight is sometimes on even when you're asleep. Now, listen, I can't tell you how many times I've been attacked in my sleep. I've been attacked in my dreams. Sometimes the fight is on even when you're asleep. And you're still required to prevail. You're still required to wrestle. So you better make yourself ready. You better be prepared at all times because the fight is when it is. Yeah, the fight is, listen, if you need a bedtime routine to make sure that you get enough sleep for that next day, you better find one. You better form one. For me, I started drinking chamomile tea. The thing's been knocking me out. It's been perfect. The fight's on the next day, though. The fight's on today. I could preach right now, go home, get attacked with misery. Oh, well. Listen, you got to be ready. You got to be wrestling consistently, constantly until that thing is fulfilled. Right? There are doors in my life I cannot force open. I've tried. But unless I fight, unless I wrestle, it ain't going to be open. It's not going to be open. It's plain and simple. And the one I'm fighting for is I'm not fighting against flesh and bone. I ain't fighting against flesh and bone. Against most flesh and bone, I can pretty solidly prevail. Not small, I'm not weak. I can prevail against flesh and bone. When it comes to the spirit, that's a different kind of fight. That's a different kind of wrestle. That's a different kind of toil. That's a different kind of struggle, and yet it is what's necessary. It's what's necessary. It's what's necessary for all of us. It's what's necessary for you. Listen, God may have called me out, but it don't matter. He could have called out everybody in here. He could tell me, at the anniversary to care about my life, that I need to fight for these things. But you know what? At that point, I was so exhausted. Because the fight has been on for years. The wrestling match has been on for years. Who isn't exhausted? Who at this point isn't exhausted? It was good no one said that I'm not exhausted, because you'd all be liars. All be straight liars. But it doesn't matter. Listen, you get exhausted, your grip weakens, start slipping away. You better find motivation somewhere. Because it's not going to stop just because you want it to. It's not going to ease up just because you want it to. You better keep fighting. You better find a new motivation. You better fight when you don't want to. You better make a routine that you can stick to. You better find something, because unless you continue, it ain't going to happen. It is not going to happen. Listen, I was told yesterday by Shay that when she was praying for me, God wants me to be patient. It's hard to be patient after years of patience. But if that's something I wrestle with, throw it on the pile. I'll take it too. I'll prevail against it too. You pick and choose what you're going to prevail against. You pick and choose what promises you're going to keep. You pick and choose what things you're going to walk in. You pick and choose what you want. But I'm going to take everything that has been promised to me. And as I've said before, I'll say it again. If you don't want it, I'll take it. That's not a threat. That's a promise. Because God's stuff is too good to be left unclaimed. God's promises are too good to be left forfeit. They are too good for me to sit back and see you just forget about it, neglect it, don't care about it, don't fight for it. They're too good. So if you don't want it, it's mine. And you're not getting it back. I'm not giving it back. You're not fighting and prevailing against me to take it back. Listen, claim what is yours. claim what is yours because it will be given away. Hi, Romans chapter 7, verse 15, 19. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. All right, so you can focus on verse 19 if the rest confuses you. But regardless, the point in coming full circle is we wrestle with doing the goodness of God in our own lives. And it is a fight that needs to be fought. If we want to see the blessings of God, if we want to see the promises of God, if we want to live in the presence of God, we must wrestle with Him until we prevail in every area. All right, whatever that area of goodness God has laid out before you in heart, mind, body, soul, and spirit, it needs to be wrestled with and fought for, and you cannot stop until you are blessed in that area. Patience isn't going to make it happen. You could be patient in the wrestling, but just straight patience isn't going to make it happen. Right? Apathy is not going to make it happen. Just plain trust isn't going to make it happen. Just plain faith isn't going to make it happen. Just plain hope isn't going to make it happen. When there's violence with it, when there's a violent faith, when there's a violent hope, when there's a violent trust, when you are a zealot for what God has promised, for what God has declared is yours, for what God wants to do in you, then it can come to pass. So in conclusion, John chapter 3, verse 18 through 21, this is Jesus. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. We have to keep fighting, wrestling, and being violent because we still have a proclivity to darkness rather than light. But to wrestle with and prevail against God is to give yourself completely over to His light. It's time for God's people to embody His light by prevailing over what God has said. Meaning it's time for us to be blessed with trust in our bodies, blessed with hope in our bodies, blessed with healing in our bodies, blessed with promises in our bodies. It is time for the sun to rise on us. And that is the word of the Lord.